Welcome to Radical Engagements here at Varn Blog. And we are on part 4 of a series, so don't start here. And in fact, since I make some criticisms of Scott Nappalos' work, I would actually hold off on starting the series until you watch the series that I did on In Struggle, which was a debate around democratic centralism and Marxist-Leninist groups in Canada, and Lars Lee's discussion of the Russian situation and how democratic centralism developed in the Bolsheviks, which had multiple meanings at different times, according to Lars Lee, and was not a general principle. And not at least until the Sixth Congress, and even that was really promoted later. And in the context originally of a civil war. So I would go back and listen to those before I touch this series, because I think this work does some good stuff, but it also doesn't focus on all the stuff I'd want it to. And I think some of the criticisms are good. Some of them conflate other theories like Vanguard Party and professional revolutionaryism, which are not actually parts of democratic centralism. They're related. They're practices of the Bolsheviks that go all the way back to the SPD and the Second International, but they are not the same principle. So just know that. We are thus 4 episodes into just this one text and my historical contextualization of this text, and I do think you need to go through and deal with the prior discussions. Another thing that this does is that it somewhat naively, and I would think in general, there's not enough discussion of the way democratic centralism was understood in the Second International, not just on the Lassallean side where it comes from, but also how it was implemented historically. And I do think that needs to be discussed more. I guess the Russian side is just sexier to most people for obvious reasons. The Russian Revolution happened, the German revolutions failed. So, there you go. All right. So we're in the in practice section. This is like section 6 if you're reading this in the document, maybe even more than that. And we're on the 4th episode, obviously. Let's get to the text. In practice, democratic centralism as a theory revolves around theses about centralization, higher and lower bodies, and the internal processes for revolutionary organization. But what about the practice? What about recent practice near to our own situation here in the United States and the conjuncture we find ourselves in? Luckily, we have accounts of people in these movements reacting on their participation in and construction of democratic centralist political organizations, not merely from one sector tendency, but from a number of different tendencies, communities, and movements. The length of some of these passages is justified because such accounts are not always readily available and provide direct insight into these groups from firsthand participants. Honing in on a few of these, we shall see trends in practice that mirror the problem in theory. It isn't that democratic centralism automatically creates bureaucratic or authoritarian practices. This is not a survey or a quantitative study of these parties. Theories are not computer programs that spit out copies of their instructions. No, they're not. That's actually important. Practices diverge, struggle, and evolve in historical contexts. Like looking across these disparate traditions and movements, we do see some regularity of such practices. And when contextualized with the internal conflict in the theory of democratic centralism, we gain tools for understanding both the theory and the practices, and perhaps a way beyond them. From these reports, we find themes of suppression of critical thinking among cadres. That's happened in non-democratic centralist groups I've been in too, though. Directive command structure from central bodies. Suppression of debate and dissent within. Holding back of the political development of cadres. That might have to do with sect formation as much as democratic centralism. But okay, we'll get back to that. We'll give this a fair shake. And unaccountable leadership / professionals. Robert Michel would just say that's oligarchical bureaucracy in almost any organization. And I think you can control it. I differ with Robel Michels that it's inevitable, but I think it is most likely. All right. Whatever deviant or not, recent U.S. democratic centralist practice reflects the acceptance of centralized directive hierarchies rather than showing them to be contested in thought or struggle. Central bodies. One of the core elements of democratic centralism is the relationship of central bodies to the party as a whole. Likewise, in the theory, in practice, this led to strong central bodies with distinct powers and direction of the party as a whole. Max Elbaum discusses democratic centralist practice in the party in pre-party democratic centralist organizations of the new communist movement, mostly Maoists, some MLs, a collection of Mao-inspired communist groups formed in the 1960s through the 1980s. Kind of in the aftermath of the first round of the New Left, the new communist movement emerges from that. I can go into the history and might in a book that I might write one day. I've written the chapter like 5 times, but I keep on rewriting it. So anyway, this is from Elbaum. All sections of the new communist movement drew heavily on selections from Mao when trying to define democratic centralism, especially his concise structure. 1. The individual is subordinate to the organization. 2. The minority is subordinate to the majority. And 3. The lower level is subordinate to the higher level. And 4. The entire membership is subordinate to the central committee. Now, that last is interesting, particularly when you add slate voting and other things that are often practiced in Marxist-Leninist and Leninist organizations to it. But not all Marxist-Leninist and Leninist organizations do slate voting. So, slate voting and also no secret ballot, etc., etc., etc. Okay. With the entire membership subordinated to the authority of the central committee, quote, these groups gave far more weight to centralism than to democracy. That's from Elbaum. In an environment of such concentrations of control, questions surface concerning where power lies and how the membership sets the agenda for the organization. And asterisk, it's actually really interesting that so many of these organizations start out fairly democratically, elect their central committee, and that central committee stays the same for like, I don't know, decades in many cases, even after the body of membership starts to fade dramatically. And yet one wonders how, because they're obviously not successful, since if they were successful, their membership wouldn't be fading. All right. Elbaum, speaking broadly across the various groups, reflects on how this structure proved mystifying and concentrated not merely decision-making in the hands of central bodies, but also the positions of the organization as a whole were set by a small group of leaders. Long quote. The new Marxist-Leninist groups function when a sophisticated division of labor and pronounced hierarchy, emphasis is mine, that's not here anyway. To exercise week-to-week leadership, the larger groups generally had some kind of central body of 5 to 12 people located in a national headquarters, termed a political bureau or an executive committee. Sometimes real power rested with even smaller subgroup dubbed a standing committee or co-chairs collective. Asterisk, sometimes they're even an informal influencers outside of the central committee, which is the worst thing because you don't know how to deal with them. I've seen that in a lot of groups, actually. But back to this. In theory, all executive committee were subordinate to the larger central committee, but in practice, the central committees were relegated to relatively passive role except in periods of upheaval. The executive committees typically retain the authority to choose which individuals would be assigned to the most important organizational post, including the newspaper, the theoretical journal, and the internal bulletin editors. Those individuals, usually members of the executive committee themselves, shape the way an organization's views would be present. While perhaps in theory, institutionalization of leadership could try to spread out that leadership, in practice, it creates a bureaucracy which with interest in preserving their control over the organization. Rather than resolving the question of building more capacity, the institutionalized power center problematized it as a struggle emerged to retain political control over the organization, particularly, again, when you're voting executive committees by slate or central committees by slate, because then it's an all or nothing proposition. You can see how that doesn't usually change, and that's why these central and executive committees tend to be fairly static. I mean, that's not how the Bolsheviks originally saw this. I will say that. It's pretty clear in 1906 and 1907. That's not what democratic centralism meant, but it's how it's been practiced in most sectarian organizations, pretty much in the United States since at least the end of the Popular Front. Right. This is clear in revolutionary moments from peaks of history, but also is evident in smaller groups from the new communist movement, as Elbaum demonstrated. And the new communist movement isn't dealing with even stuff like the Comintern Alliance, CPUSA, and stuff like that. Unaccountable professional leadership. I see this in non-democratic centralist organizations almost as badly. So I don't know if we can blame this on democratic centralism, but let's continue. While the formation of democratic centralism traditionally promoted the election of all positions, this has not always been utilized. It definitely wasn't during the underground period because they didn't think they could. I just want to add that there. They being the Bolsheviks or the Chinese Communist Party. I don't know as much about the other AES party structures. Right. In fact, the convergence of power and centralization created a situation in which the method of determining leadership became murky in practice. For the new communist movement, quote, in practice, central committees were chosen in a variety of ways, sometimes by members in each local area electing their representatives without an organization-wide Congress, asterisk. That actually happens a lot of times in organizations where the local committees send people to the nationwide congresses. So you can have stuff like small formations dominating smaller chapters and then working up that way, even though they don't really have a majority of the membership behind them. They don't need it because they were able to play the chapters game against themselves. And sometimes without elections at all. The deep sway culture and politicization of institutional leadership clearly facilitates this situation. The importance and power of leadership contributes to the atmosphere of both withdrawal from and manipulation of the direction of the organization. While the theory may promote elected leadership, the professionalization and unilateral power of directed centers makes the maintenance of that democracy more problematic. I don't think this is anywhere unique to, this is me talking, to democratic centralist organizations, though. The DSA has had professionals that were effectively very hard to recall. And you see this in liberal democratic organizations that are not centralist at all today, where like the professionals are very hard to deal with democratically and even protected sometimes by quote democratic norms because the administration is seen as a manifestation of democratic will, even when it's kind of a bureaucratic stranglehold. See the debates about the administrative state in the United States. Anyway, historically, there was a smaller repetition where that structure began to undermine the theoretical commitment to democracy. Okay. Give me more examples, bro. These practices are not merely isolated in groups inspired by Mao, however. They ran the gamut from Trotskyist to Lotta Continua, an Italian autonomia group that moved eventually to a variant Marxist-Leninism. In England, one participant in the Trotskyist movement of the same time period discusses the relationship between the full-time party leadership and the factional splits characteristic of that movement. Trotskyist and left opposition and left communist movement splits a lot. Although, so the Maoists, I think we underestimate the amount of Maoist splits there were. I mean, whole tendencies emerged that had very little to do with each other in the 70s and 80s in the Mao world in the West. All right. Speaking of the International Marxist Group, he said, quote, the bureaucratic centralism developed with the growth of the full-time apparatus. The International Marxist Group, I think that might be the precursor to the IMT/RCP, RCO. Excuse me, or not RCA, RCO. But I'm not sure. Through the magic of me digging out my research, no, it is not. The IMG emerged from the international group, which was tied to the Fourth International. It was tied to the ISFI, the International Committee for the Fourth International, tied to the Socialist Labor League. And they released Black Dwarf magazine, where Tariq Ali, of later SWP UK fame, would be an editor. They also did the Red Bull magazine, and they became the Socialist League, and then started publishing Socialist Action newspaper. Yeah, I'm not going to get into the history. British Trotskyism is its own special thing. But so no, the IMG was not the predecessor of the IMT. So I just want to make sure we get that right. A lot of these organizations, such as the Internationalist Socialist Tendency and the Independent Socialist Tendency, which eventually merged, what really want to merge from the other in a split, it's easy to get them confused. All right. Speaking of the International Marxist Group, he said the bureaucratic centralism developed with the growth of the full-time apparatus. More recently, a group of young members from the International Socialist Organization, that's the ISO, which dissolved after this was written, split and formed a new group called New Socialist Project. I don't even know if they're still around. Part of their experience was shaped by their experience with such organizations and a desire to move beyond it. And a lot of the scandals in both the SWP UK and the ISO really shaped a lot of this. And what forced a lot of that out was the fact that they had a multi-million-dollar publishing business attached to the party, Haymarket Books. Anyway, there have, ellipses, been subjective weaknesses and factors that we must face up to. In a good year, the socialist microsects recruit a handful of students and intellectuals without training them and without any systemic development process. I saw a lot of that. These sects are usually ruled by unaccountable bureaucracy that runs its micro-empire of many branches with an iron-fisted combination of elitism and myopia, whether or not they have an internal ideology or rhetoric to the contrary. We cannot dismiss fights and harsh words within a often fractured milieu. This experience and feelings are not isolated, but are pervasive in democratic centralist organizations. Without taking sides on who is in the right, we see a repetition of the struggle around unaccountable leadership with monopolies on power holding back membership and contestation around those centers of power. The debate is framed around these questions, even if different factions don't agree on who is in error. I would like some more concrete development here. You could really flesh this out. I know of more examples of this. All right. Directives, lack of critical thinking. Corresponding to the empowerment of the central bodies and the shifting power away from membership, many participants in the democratic socialist groups reference a sense of carrying out orders rather than being empowered and developed to think and act as creative cadre. I saw a lot of that. A lot of people in SALT and the ISO used to complain to me about that. This was also referenced above in the quotation aimed at the International Socialist Organization from the New Socialist Project. Coming back to the New Communist Movement, Fred Ho, who edited a book of interviews documenting the histories of some of these groups called Legacy to Liberation. In one such interview, Chris Kondo Legima describes the role of party members under the directives of the central leadership. Fred Ho. Most people don't know what democratic centralism was like. Describe it some more. CL or CI? Here's an example from doing cultural work. Here's the line, write a song with the line, period. You don't write anything else that's not the line. It's your job to write songs, perform songs to illustrate the line. That was my understanding of what democratic centralism was when it came to cultural work. So it really wasn't democratic, but directives. It was a lot of centralism, but not a lot of democracy, which was true of most of the groups. This assessment that democratic centralism meant in many instances central directives rather than active and participatory democracy is repeated in many places. Max Elbaum writes, quote, democratic centralism also meant that the central bodies were given a great deal of power to direct the work of every other party committee, unquote. The direction of the work was understood as, quote, all members were required to belong to and take assignments from a party unit, my emphasis, unquote. All of this is far cry from building organizations that can create creative, independent, and competent organizations. Asterisk, that's true, but also like democratic centralism wasn't even imposed on these groups until they were much larger than small sects in Russia or in Germany. And I do think we need to note that. The more people you have in this, the less likely this is to form a tight stranglehold in the beginning like this. But I mean, I still get that it's a problem, and maybe it's a bad part of trying to implement this from the beginning, or maybe at all. I don't know. Contrary to what Honecker argues, the military model of directives and assignments here is reproduced not merely in military context, as such was perhaps Russia, but rather in wholly dissimilar situations. Yeah, that's true. We can imagine the reason for this lies not in the authoritarian currents in society and the class contradictions within capitalism, but more importantly from the reproduction of democratic centralist ideology and its inherent tensions. I mean, we can imagine that, but you didn't prove it. I suspect it's true, but even I can't prove it. All right, suppression of dissent. Directives were not simply an activity of the central bodies in isolation. Mechanisms for securing the activity of party members required having means of ensuring internal discipline. Many groups effectively self-censored and implemented policies aimed at suppressing dissent and debate within, especially outside of the control of the central leadership. In the new communist movement, tasks were assigned as stated before. However, there were also policies aimed at limiting disagreements inside and outside the parties. Asterisk. Now, they obviously didn't work because many of these parties split. But back to the group. Members were accountable to conduct their work on the basis of group policy and follow through on all their assigned tasks, but group discipline went beyond such sensible arguments. Cadre were also responsible for defending their organization's position in all circumstances and usually prohibited from expressing differences or reservations to any non-member. Such groups even had rules forbidding members from expressing disagreement to cadre outside of their base unit. Unity in action here is interpreted not merely as democratically abiding by collective decisions, but is taken further. It is an imposition of organizational discipline against disagreement that in the most egregious cases isolated militants into cells, with the expression of dissent between cells being forbidden. Louis Project, the late Louis Project at this point, but he was alive when this was written, is a well-known blog about Marxist theory and practices, a self-described former Trotskyist and present Marxist. Big-time donor to the SWPUS. Anyway. One such article describes his experience with democratic centralism in the Trotskyist movement. There, he contests the idea that somehow Trotskyist groups were an exception to the centralization of Maoist and Stalinist parties. Quote, the Trotskyist tradition has associated with it a plethora of intellectual straitjackets, gag rules, norms about freedom of speech and order for a couple of months, even a couple of years, at least in theory, and not in order the rest of the time, demonstrated the inability to even contain even minor differences within the organization. This specifically Trotsky's side of it has been plagued by splits, expulsions, and multiplications of sects. And oh my God, has there been a lot of Trotskyist sects. Things that have degenerated more than once into spying on comrades, using police state tactics, goon squads, and in the case of the Stalinists, even murder. But there is no basis for separating the specifically Trotskyist tradition from the rest of it. History has shown that there is little room even for the healthiest Trotskyist-Leninist party for diversity of views as it is amongst even the pro-Moscow Stalinist or Maoist, or as close as it makes to no serious difference. Unquote. Against seeing the issues as inherently problems of one or another Leninist tradition, we see such experiences repeated throughout the critical literature by Leninists. Don Hammerquest was a youth member of the Communist Party USA and a red diaper baby. Hammerquest had been a lifelong revolutionary and helped found the Sojourner Truth organization on Gramscian and Leninist basis after being expelled from the CPUSA. It's a long tradition there. In this next passage, though long, gives unique insight into the functioning of these groups as they attempted to manage the formation of the information members received and the filtered responses and criticism of the party decisions through tightly controlled central structure, whether this was effective or not. It doesn't seem to have been very effective. Long quote. It was a bit of diversions, but usually related personnel experience might highlight how the ML, Marxist-Leninist approach to democratic and participatory discussion on serious issues actually worked. By the close of the 1950s, there was ample evidence in this country, some of which was widely reported in the capitalist press, between the divisions between China and the Soviet Union were growing larger and more antagonistic, definitely, and we see this splits the CPUSA eventually. Nevertheless, this was not acknowledged in the CPUSA and definitely not a permitted topic for membership speculation. The official Sino-Soviet break came at the 81 party meeting in the fall of 1960. The New York Times immediately carried out a detailed report, despite the fact that the meeting was supposed to have been closed. The Times reporting had substantial credibility, since a couple years earlier it had also printed Khrushchev's secret report to a closed session of the 20th Congress of the CPUSU and forced that report to be made public before the communist apparatus was prepared to deal with the repercussions. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Joe Hill's rebel girl, was the chairwoman of the U.S. Communist Party and had headed the delegation to the 81 party meeting. The U.S. delegation had included the Chicago jeweler Morris Childs, aka Solo, a longtime FBI asset, who we now know was the source of the New York Times reports. Immediately after the Moscow meeting, Gurley Flynn toured the country to report back to the party, and I was at two such meetings. The first was for a definitely atypical group of rank-and-file communists, including my parents. The meeting included a number of knowledgeable activists who were not docile receptacles for anyone's line and who read the New York Times. Gurley Flynn was asked about the reports of the split between China and the Soviet Union and categorically denied that it had happened, as people wish was true today. Launching into a heavy attack on, quote, comrades who rely too much on the capitalist press and its lies and distortions. At the meeting of the district leadership of Washington and Oregon the very next day, a large meeting populated by hacks who would never think to raise embarrassing questions or to question anything that came from the party authority, Gurley Flynn began her report quite differently. I still remember the words quite well. Comrades, I regret having to report that the Chinese comrades have fallen in complete adventurism and petty bourgeois leftism, and have split with the international communist movement and the working class. Why the difference in reports? I asked at the time and was told that it was important to organize and plan such discussions carefully in order to maintain morale and discipline. Yeah, that didn't really work. That was the centralized guidance meant to me in the U.S. Communist Party, and it looked remarkably like what Mao is pushing in the Chinese Party in this period. The discussion only happened in a managed framework after the party leadership decided what a flower and what is a weed for the cadre of slow wilting gardeners to prune to fits of depression. And long quote. This is a good example of the infamous incoherence of the political line of communist parties, which people associate with repressive times under the Soviet bureaucracies and secret police. Again, it was not isolated. It isn't the exception, but centers around attempts to manage information and perception of events. This is a natural course for people, but it is a different animal when a paid institutional hierarchy armed with the ideology of a self-appointed leadership of the future revolution uses it to maintain their dominance. I hesitate to put a reference to the Revolutionary Communist Party because of its infamy for personality cults and a broad consensus among the left of its questionable activity. Yet the quality, detail, and reflection given by Mark Eli of the Kasama Project, now defunct, and I think it was defunct by like 2014, concerning the Revolutionary Communist Party's homophobic position show detailed and similar manipulations of debate and eternal discussion of central bodies as seen above. The RCP took a long time to change its line there, even longer than like the USSR and the Chinese Communist Party did. Anyway, the secrecy associated with those parties makes confessions of internal activity valuable in understanding how democratic centralist groups in our time function. Long quote from Mike Ellie. I had interactions with Mike Ellie back in the day. Not many. We exchanged emails in 2011 and 12. But anyway, from 1970 until 2001, that late, the RCP held that homosexuality was incompatible with the revolutionary communist goals and ideology, kind of like the ACP now. Gay men and lesbians could not be members. Formal programmatic statements had held that homosexuality would be abolished under socialism through the ideological struggle or re-education. The party's wrong and backward views became rather notorious through the 1980s as the AIDS crisis exploded and the Republican right sought to exploit anti-homosexual bigotry. What is less well known is that such views were maintained. In the early 1970s, it was said that gay people couldn't be communists because they were a security risk of blackmail. See the Whitaker Chambers Alger Hiss incident. Then, after the party's founding in 1975, the stress was on ways homosexuality was linked to bourgeois degeneracy. Then, after 1988, the argument was that homosexuality had to be rejected because male homosexuality supposedly was inherently hostile to women, and lesbianism was supposedly an inherently manifestation of lifestyle reformism. In other words, over the first 30 plus years of the RURCP, the end verdict, the incompatibility of homosexuality with communism, remained the same, while the public justification for the position morphed with time. And there were essentially no open discussions of these views allowed within the party's ranks, though controversy and debate increasingly raged around the party's youth brigade, the RCYB. By the late 1990s, the anti-homosexual politics were so controversial inside and outside the party that it would have been impossible to create a new program without major changes. The question was open briefly but shut down when discussion proved highly volatile. The method used for cutting off this debate is revealing. The new party analysis acknowledged that homosexuality is not inherently counter-revolutionary, but insisted that the party's longstanding condemnation of gay people had not come from any influence of anti-gay bigotry. The error, it was said, came from the general problems of method and reductionism, not from anti-gay prejudices within the party. It was officially argued that the question of homosexuality itself had never been a cardinal question, but the method used to criticize the party's previous position had been considered a cardinal question. Translated, the party was still not considered the previous anti-gay era as a huge deal, but it would consider any discussions of possible homophobia among its leaders to be completely intolerable. Also considered hostile to the party, any discussion of why the change in line had taken so long, longer than it did in official communist countries, any appraisal of the huge political cost of the revolution became of this error, and any discussion of the closet within the party, the ways in which secretly gay and bisexual members have been forced to deny their own sexual orientation. Up until 2001. In short, the party had adopted a new and truly better approach to homosexuality, but has slammed the door hard on any real exploration of the anti-gay bigotry among the communists and its real-world consequences. What emerges from such methods is a party where discussions are maddeningly confined and ritualized. They generally take place only after positions or even after a whole new synthesis have been formally adopted. Questions are open so that a new orthodoxy can replace an old one, and the discussions are slammed shut again. Through this process, ready agreement is expected. Real dissent is assumed to be backwards or worse. And this is from Mark Eli, 9 Letters to Comrades, Getting Beyond Bhagavat's New Synthesis, 2007, Kasama Project. And yeah, Kasama Project is long gone. The RCP is still around, although it's still kind of what it was. It's still kind of Bob Abakian's brainchild. And anyway, rather than seeing a nuance around how political center can facilitate great thought, discussion, and cadre development, we see the opposite. It isn't that such a theory, such as democratic centralism, will resolve all on-the-ground problems for us, yet democratic centralism makes itself vulnerable by claiming to be a theory which does center around political development of its members internally and a vanguard force externally. That flaming, combined with the institutionalization of a directed hierarchy, creates a problematic environment in which the development of a culture of critical thinking, cadre development, and ability to be flexible and adaptive is suppressed rather than facilitated. The retardation of development. Limitations on debate and the command structure of the party activity go hand in hand, while holding back the development of competent creative organizers. Such a theme is repeated across tendencies. Louis Project discusses the cultivated subservience of members to leadership in the world and the Socialist Workers' Party. Quote, I always remember one reoccurring type of incident from my days in the SWP leadership that symbolizes for me one of the biggest problems with what was to come to be called Leninism. This is before Project adopted what I might call Kamehoism. And that is when some big development would take place, and younger comrades, and disproportionately women comrades, would ask what we thought of it. It happened time and again around the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, the overthrow of the Grenadian revolutionary government by the Cord faction, yes, in the name of democratic centralism, the Peruvian embassy crisis in Cuba, and the subsequent Mariel boat lift, the Iranian Revolution. What did we think of it? That was the question. Acceptance of whatever truth was about to be revealed was assumed, automatic, and unquestioned. The Autonomia, a broad movement of Italy's upsurges during the 1970s, was known for its creativity and novel theory that in social struggles, both inside and outside the workplace. Yet, when one of the Autonomia groups transitioned from a rather uninformed revolutionary grouping to a Marxist-Leninist democratic centralist group, a lot of Autonomia groups started as ML groups, by the way, despite what is often told you, similar problems began to emerge. We see the discussion in a blog around the Big Flame, an autonomous group from England in the 1970s that drew from that tradition. Their analysis draws from the Italian primary sources within Lotta Continua, otherwise unavailable in English. Okay, let's see what we got here. Long quote. Lotta Continua's organization prior to 1973 was rudimentary. Apart from the decision making at the National Convention, it was run by a group of old friends. Solfrey, in his 1976 Congress speech, confessed to a private patrimony. Then things changed. The theoretical and political formation of cadres, the election of leaders, the individual's responsibility to the militant in the framework of collective discipline, the division of tasks and specializations, ellipses. It is nothing else than the discovery of democratic centralism and the Third Internationalist concept as a party. Bowie Bow, page 330, translation by Della Porta, page 88. As a result, from 1973 onwards, the possibility of comrades contributing to the formation of the political line was reduced. The responsibility for the major decisions was ever more concentrated at the top of the pyramid. Though some looking to democratic centralism as a way to move beyond the inability of the movement to develop people, facilitate greater creativity and strategy and action, etc., historically we see the autonomous wing of the democratic centralist a tendency to reduce such. Don Hammerquist, again drawing from experience in the Communist Party USA, describes a repressive campaign that ran against such developments. Criticism and engaging the positions of the leadership were seen as attacks, and the interactions among the base to develop ideas were actively repressed and discouraged. Long quote. One of the impacts of the Soviet domination of the international movement in the prior decades was the cloistering and sanitizing of important aspects of the revolutionary theory in the relevant intellectual history. The Soviet-identified Communist parties actively discouraged any study of primary writings in the Communist tradition, specifically Capital, and opposed any attempts to place major theoretical contributions and debates into their actual historical context. Instead, a list of good and bad authors, a few section pieces from Engels, Marx, and Lenin, and some terrible attempts at summarizations and popularizations from House intellectuals were presented as a finished and closed scientific system with simple lessons to be internalized and obeyed, but with nothing that challenged or was meant to be challenged. Long ellipses. In 1968, a group of us in the CPUSA were disciplined by the National Board, and a little later, I was put on trial before the National Committee for factionalism. A number of issues were involved, one of which related indirectly to Althusser. We were charged with engaging in horizontal discussions within the party and opening up discussions to individuals and groupings outside of the party. The historical precedent for this form of discipline in the communist movement stretches back to the 10th Congress of the CPSU, but is pretty much unknown before that time. Hammerquist. Our particular factional discussion centered around a document that challenged the party's program, which was then in draft form. End quote. It is not simply that these organizations failed to facilitate greater development, but they were organized against such happening. There were systematic attempts to prevent the growth and independent thought amongst cadre and the disciplinary regime that would respond to potential new powers. Obviously, a retributive or adversarial orientation outwards towards the multiplication of leadership and the movement is reactionary and suicidal. The history raises this question on how democratic centralism can capitalize on the strength of such disagreement and development, given its rotation around an axis of that political center. And we will stop here for now. We'll have one more before we finish this text. I actually want more examples from Russia and Germany, but these are pretty good for the sectarian culture of the movements in the United States. One of the issues, however, is that these movements were very small compared to the European movements. So it's very hard to know if it's reflective. I mean, I happen to know that it's pretty reflective of a lot of stuff that happened abroad, particularly during the Sino-Soviet split, but at least in the French CPs and the Italian CPs. But I would like more examples to prove that. All right. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. There's more behind the Patreon, blah, blah, blah. Protect your peace.